The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, Parts 1 and 2. Welcome to the playlist of the narration of The Pilgrim's Progress by John Bunyan, 1678. I strongly advise to listen to the introduction, to acquaint oneself with the author, and to fully grasp the meaning of allegory. The city of destruction, for example, is not, I repeat, not a place, but a state of mind. The biographical note, then, is important. Thereafter, there are no chapters to the two parts of John Bunyan's work, but for reference purposes, I list the characters and events introduced in each section before I begin the unadulterated narration. These characters may also be found in the description of each video. I hope that listeners may enjoy and profit from repeatedly listening to John Bunyan's allegory of the Christian life, which is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Thank you. So then, the biographical note. If a good book is a candle, then John Bunyan lighted 3 great candles, and after 3 centuries they have not grown dim. Pilgrim's Progress has come to be known as the greatest religious allegory in the world. Few will dispute Macaulay's judgment that the next best is Bunyan's Holy War. The 3rd candle is his spiritual autobiography, Grace Abounding. If only one of these had been lighted, Bunyan's literary immortality would have been secure. To have kindled 3 such lights was a wonderful achievement, and the wonder grows as we reflect that the work was done by a one-time tinker who shouldered his matchlock in the Parliamentary War and spent 1/5 of his whole lifetime in prison. But Bunyan also wrote The Life and Death of Mr. Badman, not an allegory or a treatise, but a realistic piece of fiction. Daniel Defoe is usually awarded the title of Father of the English Novel, but Mr. Badman was written 40 years before Defoe's Robinson Crusoe. There is therefore point in Kipling's description of Bunyan as salvation's first Defoe. Moreover, he wrote rhymes as well as immortal prose. If we turn to the Oxford Anthology of English Verse, we find that he has given a niche in it among the bards of England. We all know, who would true valour see? And he that is down need fear no fall. But he also wrote a sort of child's garden of verse, delightful little rhymes with morals attached about tops and hoops and moles and moths and larks and spiders. He was the author, all told, of about 60 books and pamphlets. John Bunyan, then, was born in the village of Elstow near Bedford in 1628, 12 years after Shakespeare's death. There were Bunyans who held land in Elstow as far back as 1199. The family fortunes, however, had declined considerably by the 17th century, and Bunyan's father, Thomas Bunyan, made his living as a brazier or tinker. All the same, we can see by Thomas's last will and testament that the family clung to something of the grand manor. Imprimis I give unto my son John Bunyan 1 shilling, and to son Thomas and daughter Mary a like sum, to be paid within a year after their father's death. Of the father we have also this record, for we may assume that it relates to Thomas. Anno 1625, one Bunyan of Elstow, climbing of rocks' nests in the berry wood, found 8 rooks in a nest, all white as milk, and not a black feather on them. We know that son John was given some schooling, for he could write later, I'm no poet nor a poet's son, but a mechanic guided by no rule, but what I gained in grammar school. We see him in those early days as a talkative, red-headed village boy, fond of games and story reading, with an excitable imagination, which sometimes disturbed him with terrifying dreams of the powers of darkness. He seems to have been something of a madcap, and twice narrowly escaped death by drowning. Strolling one day in the fields, he came across an adder, stunned it with his stick, and prizing its jaws open, removed its sting. At 16, he was drawn for a soldier and marched off to fight in the Parliamentary War. He was mustered with the Newport garrison toward the end of 1644, and seems to have been at the siege of Leicester in the summer of 1645. Perhaps it was at this siege which he allegorized in the Holy War. I saw the prince's armed men come down, by troops, by thousands, to besiege the town. I saw the captains, heard the trumpet sound, and how his forces covered all the ground. After his discharge, he took up his father's trade and trundled his tinker's forge along the roads and lanes of Bedford. He always had the gift of language. In his youth it took the form of bad language, and probably his army life developed it. One day, unexpectedly rebuked by a woman for being the worst swearer she had ever heard, he made an end of the habit on the spot, and marvelled as the days passed, as the new and clean mouth that was his. Whereas before I knew not how to speak unless I put an oath before and another behind, to make my words have authority, now I could, without it, speak better and with more pleasantness than ever I could before. It was an artist's discovery of his art, and presently he was to turn it to great account, for Bunyan was certainly an artist in the use of the English tongue, though he was very much more. Of his continued love of sport, his liking for bell-ringing and Sunday games, we read in Grace Abounding, as also of his early and happy marriage, his little blind child to whom he was so tenderly attached, and of his growing pride in his own thrifty respectability as a good citizen and churchman. For by now, through the influence of his young, believing wife and the reading of good books, he was outwardly very much reformed, so that his neighbours, he tells us, used to exclaim, "What has happened to John?" Then later came his evangelical conversion, which made a new man of him, and without which we should certainly never have had Pilgrim's Progress or the Holy War or Grace Abounding. What now filled his heart was a sense of the abounding grace of God, the love of Christ for sinful folk. I quote, "I could have spoken of his love and his mercy," he says, "even to the very crows that sat upon the ploughed land before me, had they been capable to have understood me." Soon Bunyan became a preacher. He was then about 27 and had moved into Bedford town, where he had joined a congregation which at that time was part of the national church. And certainly we must not think of him as a freelance gospeller or religious zealot who took to preaching on his own account. He did not put himself forward, but was urged by the local church, which had the discernment to recognize his unusual gifts, so that, as he says, after some solemn prayer and fasting, he was more particularly called forth and appointed to the public preaching of the word. He was not an ordained clergyman, of course. He was still a tinker by trade, but he preached, when invited, from the pulpits of parish churches, as well as in other meeting places. Sometime during this early period, his wife died, and presently he married again. With the Restoration of 1660 came a new national order and policy which sent Bunyan to prison as an unauthorized person who, refused to leave off his preaching. He suffered imprisonment from November 1660 to May 1672, and again for some 6 months ending in 1676. The long term was served in the county prison in Silver Street, Bedford, the second in the town lockup on the bridge. On the whole, it was not a very rigorous confinement. He was free to work for his living, tagging shoelaces, free to receive his wife and 4 children and visiting friends, free to keep in touch with his church, and free even to preach within the prison precincts. Above all, he was free to write his books, and it was during his second imprisonment that the first part of Pilgrim's Progress was completed. He had got the idea of it from a sermon he had made on the Heavenly Footman, and no masterpiece was ever more easily written. He tells us that he set pen to paper with delight, and that the story practically dictated itself. For having now, he said, my method by the end, still as I pulled it came. He tells us too that he wrote it as a diversion, and that some said, John, print it. Others said, not so. Some said, it might do good. Others said, no. He lived long enough to see his book, My Pilgrim, as he liked to call it, travel far and wide on the continent, cross the Atlantic and receive a great welcome in New England, and pass into no less than 11 editions in Great Britain. After his final release in 1676, Bunyan had 12 more years to live. He was now minister of Bedford Meeting. He had been called to this office in 1671, whilst he was still a prisoner in Silver Street, and his fame as a preacher had spread far and wide. Not unlike the Apostle Paul. Sometimes on his preaching journeys he would ride up to London. When the bellman announced his arrival for a preaching service, hardly a hall in the city was big enough to hold the crowds that would flock to hear him. As an eyewitness wrote, half were fain to go back again for want of room, and then himself was fain at a back door to be pulled almost over people to get upstairs to his pulpit. He was something of a social reformer too, and knew how to deal shrewd blows against the evils of his time, particularly extortion and oppressively low wages. Perhaps some, he remarks, will find fault with my meddling thus, but since such actions are evil, it is time they were hissed out of the world. Stout Puritan and dissenter as he was no less truly a great churchman who looked and laboured for the day when all Christian people should find unity in one great evangelical apostolic church. The unveiling of a window to his memory in Westminster Abbey in 1912 was a fitting recognition of this. He died in London on August the 31st, 1688, and was buried in Bunhill Fields. He was 60 years old. And now, before concluding this short sketch, we must note one completely unjust but very common criticism of Pilgrim's Progress. It is that it sets forth a self-centred religion. The Christian pilgrim, it is argued, fled from the city of destruction to save his own life, leaving his wife and children, his friends and neighbours behind, when it would have been much nobler if he had remained in the city and tried to reform it, or at least to save his fellows. This is to misunderstand the allegory altogether. The city of destruction from which the pilgrim fled does not stand for an actual town, but for a state of mind, a disposition of the will, a way of life. If we think of some of the other place names in the allegory, this is at once clear. Stupidity, conceit, apostasy, the Slough of Despond, Doubting Castle, the Village of Morality. Each of these is obviously a mental state or else a way of life. Therefore, when the pilgrim is represented as fleeing from the city of destruction, it means that he flees from a state of mind or course of life that he knows to be wrong. If Bunyan had made him remain in the city, it would have meant, according to the terms of the allegory, that he remained in his bad state of mind, and there would have been no Pilgrim's Progress to write about. When, however, Bunyan gets his pilgrims as far as Vanity Fair, he is able to stretch his allegory sufficiently to represent the reformist aspect of the Christian life. For Vanity Fair represents not simply the worldly mind, but European civilization, where we have Britain Row, French Row, German Row, Italian Row. And the pilgrims do not flee from it, but pass through it, and set themselves stoutly against those abuses in the town, which have themselves been set up against him who is higher than the highest, so much so that before the dream ends, the town is by way of being reformed. So we may end with Bunyan's own admonition: take heed in playing with the outside of my dream. Put by the curtains, look within the veil. And that short biographical note was written by Gwilym O. Griffith,